Somewhere beneath the streets of one of the world's most crowded cities, buried under centuries of stone and silence, lies a civilization so advanced that the men who destroyed it could scarcely believe what they had seen. In the year 1325, a wandering people guided by a god's prophecy looked down at a marshy island in the middle of a great lake and decided, against all reason, that this was the place they had been promised. What rose from those shallow waters over the next 2 centuries was not merely a city, but a world unto itself. A place of floating gardens, towering temples, and a marketplace that humbled the finest bazaars of Europe. By the time foreign eyes first glimpsed its skyline, Tenochtitlan housed more than 200,000 souls, rivaling the greatest capitals on earth. Then came the strangers from across the sea, and within 2 years, the most magnificent city in the Western Hemisphere had been reduced to rubble and ash. But the city did not truly die. It only descended, waiting in the dark beneath the living world above, patient as the ancient gods its people once worshipped. Welcome back, dear traveller, to Whispered Empires, where the great stories of history are told softly, slowly, and just for you. If this is your first time here, we are so glad you found us, and we invite you to like and subscribe so these journeys can continue finding their way to you each night. Before we begin, we would love to know, what time is it where you are and where in the world are you watching from? And tonight, as we prepare to walk the ancient causeways of the greatest city of the pre-Columbian Americas, we have one question for you. Did you know that Tenochtitlan may have been larger than any European city of its time? Chapter 1. The Prophecy and the Island. Founding of Tenochtitlan. Long before the great city rose from the waters, there was a people wandering. The Mexica, Nahuatl-speaking descendants of a vast northern world, moved slowly southward through the centuries, carrying their traditions, their language, and the memory of a homeland they called Aztlan. They were one branch of a larger family of Nahua peoples, related to the Culhua, the Tepaneca, the Acolhua. Yet among all these kindred groups, the Mexica walked a singular path, guided by a destiny they believed had been woven into existence long before any of them were born. Their origin story reached back to Aztlan, a place whose name meant the place of whiteness, or the place of the heron. In mythological memory, Aztlan was a paradise of still waters, abundant birds, and lush vegetation. At its heart stood a steep hill called Colhuacan, and within it, Chicomoztoc, the place of the 7 caves, where 7 Nahua tribes, including the Mexica, were said to have originated. Whether Aztlan was a true place or a landscape of the spirit remains a question without a final answer. Scholars have proposed Mexcaltitan in Nayarit as a possible location, but the debate lingers gently, unresolved. Archaeological evidence and linguistic studies suggest the Mexica's true origins lay in the American Southwest, in a region corresponding to present-day southwestern United States. Nahuatl, their language, shares features with Puebloan tongues such as Hopi and Ute, reflecting ancient shared geography. Over roughly 200 years during the 13th century, the Mexica moved southward in a gradual migration, settling briefly at various places, including Tlaxcala and Cholula, encountering other peoples along the way. They were often regarded as rough outsiders, unrefined newcomers in a world already shaped by older, more established civilizations. And yet, they kept moving, as if drawn forward by something they could not name, guiding the Mexica through all of this, through every hardship, every rebuff, every year of wandering, was their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli. His name meant hummingbird of the south. He was the god of war and of the sun, and to the Mexica, he was everything: protector, commander, and the living promise of a future not yet seen. It was Huitzilopochtli who had commanded them to leave Aztlan. It was his voice, preserved through priests and oral tradition, that told them to separate from the other tribes and take a new name. In some codices, the god is depicted being carried on the back of a migrating figure, present always, never absent from the journey. The prophecy Huitzilopochtli gave his people was precise and patient. They were to wander until they witnessed a singular sign, a golden eagle perched upon a prickly pear cactus, clutching a serpent. This vision would rise from stones surrounded by water, and it would mark the place where the Mexica were destined to build their city. The eagle represented the sun itself, light, victory, and Huitzilopochtli's own spirit. The serpent spoke of the earth, of natural forces, of the ancient chaos that civilization must learn to hold. The cactus, rooted in stone amid water, was the union of opposing forces, a symbol of something enduring growing where nothing should. In the year traditionally recorded as 1325, the Mexica found what they had been seeking. On a small island in the western portion of Lake Texcoco, in the high valley of central Mexico, they witnessed the prophesied sign. The island itself was modest, low and marshy, covered in wetland grasses, willows, and reeds, its soil made of lake-deposited silt and clay. But it was alive with resources: fish, axolotl, waterfowl, edible plants, and freshwater springs. What others had overlooked or dismissed as too unstable for settlement, the Mexica recognized as the place their god had prepared for them across 2 centuries of wandering. The founding story is preserved across many surviving codices and colonial-era manuscripts. The Codex Boturini, composed around 1530, traces the migration through footprints and year-count glyphs. The Codex Oban and the Tira de la Peregrinación record stages of the journey with pictographs and speech scrolls. The Codex Aztec depicts Huitzilopochtli, the sacrificial ritual of Copil, and the cactus growing from the ground. The Codex Mendoza and the manuscript Tovar each preserve their own version of the founding scene. Taken together, these documents create a layered narrative, not a single account, but many voices retelling the same sacred memory from slightly different angles. The island the Mexica chose was not desirable to those who already lived in the valley. Established powers, the Tepanec of Azcapotzalco, the Culhua of Culhuacan, the Chichimec kingdom of Tenayuca, regarded the Mexica as barbaric outsiders. The marshy terrain offered unstable ground, saline water, poor agricultural conditions, and clouds of insects rising from the wetlands. Other groups had passed over such places precisely because they were difficult. The Mexica had no choice but to make their home in the spaces no one else wanted. And so they began on uncertain ground, with few resources, surrounded by more powerful neighbors who did not yet know what these wanderers would become. In their earliest years on the island, the Mexica were subordinate to the Tepanec state of Azcapotzalco, which had become the dominant power of the region under its ruler, Tezozomoc. For roughly the first 50 years after settling, the Mexica functioned as tributaries, supplying warriors to support Azcapotzalco's campaigns and receiving a portion of tribute in return. It was a humble position, but it was also a foundation. Through military service, the Mexica began to build a reputation. They demonstrated what they were capable of. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of the valley began to shift. The name they gave their city carried the landscape of the prophecy within it. Tenochtitlan, from the Nahuatl tetl, meaning rock, Nochtli, meaning prickly pear cactus, and the suffix tlan, meaning place of, the place among rocks where the cactus grows. Some scholars have also suggested the city may have been named in honor of Tenoch, a founding Mexica leader whose name contains similar linguistic roots. The precise etymology remains gently uncertain, but the meaning felt unmistakable to those who built their first shelters there. Reed huts on uncertain ground at the edge of a vast lake, in the exact place a god had promised them centuries before. Modern historians and archaeologists approach this founding story with careful, measured thought. The date of 1325 was formally declared in 1925 to mark a 600th anniversary, and scholars acknowledge that precise historical dating is impossible. Tenochtitlan likely grew gradually from a settlement in the early 1320s, rather than appearing in a single moment. Colonial-era codices blend myth with memory, and the archaeological record cannot pinpoint a single founding event. What emerges from all of this is not a contradiction, but a layering, the mythological and the historical coexisting, each illuminating the other in ways neither can fully achieve alone. From a humble island chosen by prophecy, the Mexica would do what seemed impossible. And in the chapters ahead, we will watch as that marshy outpost transformed, stone by stone and generation by generation, into one of the most extraordinary cities the world had ever seen. Chapter 2: Building the Impossible City. Engineering and Architecture. Rising from the still waters of Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan did not simply occupy the land, it created it. The city was organized around 4 great quarters, each aligned to a cardinal direction, with the sacred center holding sky and earth together. This was no accident of settlement. Every canal, every causeway, every courtyard reflected the Aztec understanding of the cosmos. The city itself was a living map of the universe, its streets and waterways echoing the mythological order that the Mexica believed sustained all creation. 3 great causeways carried the city outward across the lake. One reached north toward Tepeyac, another stretched south to Iztapalapa. The third extended west toward Tlacopan. Wide enough for 10 horses to walk abreast, these stone roads were not merely paths. They were the bones of the city's connection to the world beyond its waters. At intervals, removable wooden bridges allowed canoes to pass freely beneath, and in times of danger, those same bridges could be lifted away, leaving the city sealed and sovereign behind its shimmering moat. Woven between the causeways and neighborhoods ran a vast network of canals. Main waterways stretched east to west, 3 to 5 meters wide, while narrower secondary channels reached into every district and calpulli across the city's 4 zones. Raised stone streets followed the canals so that foot travelers and canoe rowers moved through the city side by side. Single log dugout canoes carried food, stone, and tribute across the grid. Even massive monoliths weighing many tons were guided through the principal canals, a quiet testament to the depth and order of this waterborne civilization. Beyond the city's edges, the lake itself had been transformed. Chinampas, raised garden beds constructed on the shallow lake floor, spread outward in great rectangular bands, covering an estimated 15,000 hectares at the system's height. Workers staked out perimeters in the lake bed, wove willow and reed fences into frames, then layered mud, sediment, and decaying vegetation until the surface rose above the water. Willow trees planted along the edges held the beds firm. Between each chinampa, channels roughly 1.5 meters deep, served both irrigation and navigation, drawing water to the roots through quiet capillary action. The productivity of the chinampa system was remarkable. Maize, beans, squash, amaranth, tomatoes, chili peppers, avocados, herbs, and flowers all grew in these fertile beds. Because the channels provided continuous moisture to plant roots through capillary action, the gardens did not depend on rainfall alone. As many as 7 harvests each year were possible, supplying the bulk of daily sustenance for the hundreds of thousands living in the capital. The chinampa system reduced the city's reliance on tribute from conquered territories and generated surplus for trade. A quiet engine of abundance turning shallow water into living fields. Fresh water presented its own challenge to a city surrounded by the brackish lake. Tenochtitlan's engineers solved this through a remarkable twin-pipe aqueduct. Water was drawn from freshwater springs at Chapultepec and carried along 2 parallel clay-lined channels resting on artificial islands spaced across the lake. If one channel became contaminated, flow could be redirected through the other without interruption. Once inside the city, water moved through stone and wooden conduits called apantles to public fountains, noble residences, and chinampa irrigation channels. It was a redundant, resilient system, thoughtfully designed for a city that could not afford to go thirsty. When floodwaters threatened the city, it was the Great Dike of Nezahualcoyotl that held them back. Built around 1445 to 1449, this remarkable structure stretched approximately 16 kilometers, running from Aztec in the north to Iztapalapa in the south, standing 8 meters high and 3.5 meters wide. It divided the lake, keeping the brackish waters of Lake Texcoco separated from the freshwater basin surrounding Tenochtitlan. For approximately 70 years, it never failed. Not once. When Spanish forces destroyed it during the siege of 1521, the flooding that followed in the coming decades revealed just how essential this quiet wall of earth and stone had always been. At the heart of the island rose the sacred precinct. A serpent wall of Cotepantli enclosed a raised quadrangular space, measuring roughly 340 meters north to south and 360 meters east to west, covering more than 12 hectares. Within that boundary, approximately 45 public buildings and 78 religious structures stood, painted in brilliant symbolic colors. 4 main entrances opened toward the cardinal directions, each leading inward through a landscape of stairways, platforms, and shrines. The precinct was not simply a place of worship, it was the cosmological center of the entire Aztec world, the still point around which the empire turned. The Templo Mayor stood at the center of it all, A twin pyramid structure approximately 100 meters wide at its base and rising perhaps 90 feet. It carried two shrines at its summit. The southern shrine was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the Aztec patron deity. The northern shrine honored Tlaloc, god of rain and agricultural abundance. The two deities faced each other at the peak of a single mountain of stone, embodying the Aztec understanding that war and sustenance, conquest and rain were inseparable forces. Beneath and around the Templo Mayor, successive rulers had expanded the structure across multiple building phases spanning generations. Beyond the Templo Mayor, the sacred precinct held many other structures. A circular temple dedicated to the wind, god Ehecatl Quetzalcoatl, rose 60 steps high. An 80-step pyramid honored Tezcatlipoca, lord of destiny. Calmecac schools prepared noble youths. A Tlachtli ball court occupied its own solemn space. Tzompantli skull racks displayed the remains of sacrificial offerings. Armories, guest temples for visiting foreign rulers, and small ritual platforms called momostli filled the remaining grounds. Just outside the precinct's walls, royal palaces spread across the surrounding land. And beyond those, the residential districts and Chinampa plantations of a vast, breathing, living city. Stone, timber, and adobe gave form to every corner of the city. Stone came from quarries and was shaped into the great temples and public buildings. Adobe bricks formed the walls of ordinary homes, wood-framed roofs and bridges. The rulers who shaped this construction, Itzcoatl, who founded the Triple Alliance and laid the framework for imperial expansion. Moctezuma I, who ordered the great temple of Huitzilopochtli and the double aqueduct. Ahuitzotl, who completed the sixth great phase of the Templo Mayor. Each added their own layer to the city rising from the lake. What they built together endures still, buried quietly beneath the streets of modern Mexico City, waiting in the earth. Yet no city, however brilliantly engineered, exists by stone and water alone. And as we move deeper into Tenochtitlan, we find a civilization of equal richness in its commerce, its rituals, and the daily lives of the hundreds of thousands who called it home. Chapter 3. Life inside the great city. Markets, temples, and society. Tenochtitlan, in the early 16th century, held somewhere between 150,000 and 400,000 souls within its boundaries. A city that dwarfed nearly every metropolis in Europe. London, at that same moment in time, sheltered perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. Hernán Cortés himself, writing to the Spanish crown, compared this island capital to Seville and Córdoba. And those who walked its streets, men who had seen Constantinople, who had visited Rome, found themselves quietly stunned. The city they stood inside was not what they had expected. It was grander and far more ordered than anything they had known. At the heart of daily life in this vast city lay the marketplace of Tlatelolco, the largest and most organized tianguis in all of Mesoamerica. Cortés described it as twice the size of the Spanish city of Salamanca. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who walked its crowded lanes 4 days after arriving in Tenochtitlan, wrote of his astonishment at the multitude of people and merchandise, all maintained in a remarkable order he had never encountered before. Estimates suggest that between 20,000 and 60,000 people, vendors and shoppers alike, gathered here each day with numbers rising still higher during special market weeks. The stalls of Tlatelolco were not arranged in chaos. Each section of the marketplace held its own designated goods, and merchants kept to their appointed places. Fresh tomatoes, avocados, and maize in many colors occupied one quarter. Live turkeys, rabbits, and small dogs stood in another. Cooked foods and prepared porridges had their own corner. Textiles of richly dyed cloth, fine ceramics, jade jewelry, obsidian tools, and delicacies of honey and nougat each claimed their proper lane. Government inspectors moved among the stalls, watching prices, settling disputes, and ensuring that commerce flowed in fair and proper order. The market ran not on coins, but on cacao beans, cotton cloaks, and gold dust sealed inside transparent quills. Beyond the marketplace moved a shadowed class of travelers, the Posteca, the professional long-distance merchants of the Aztec Empire. Operating under imperial authority and answering ultimately to the emperor himself, these men journeyed far beyond the city's canals, venturing into distant lands to acquire tropical bird feathers, jade, turquoise, cacao, obsidian, and fine cotton. They carried not only goods, but intelligence, serving quietly as the empire's ears and eyes in foreign territories. A secretive subgroup among them, the Nahualostomeca, traveled in disguise, trading in small, valuable items while gathering strategic information for the Aztec military. Their patron deity was Yaxcatecutli, the god of travelers and commerce. Rising above all of Tenochtitlan, visible from every quarter of the city, stood the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. Its base measured roughly 100 by 80 meters, and at its final height, it rose 60 meters into the sky. Built first around 1325, the structure was enlarged and rebuilt 7 times by successive emperors, each new layer encasing the one before. 2 great stairways climbed its face, each reserved solely for priests. At the summit stood twin shrines. The northern shrine honored Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture. The southern shrine was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. Together they held the sky and the earth in a single sacred form. The ceremonies of the Templo Mayor followed the pulse of 2 interlocking calendars. The Tonalpohualli, a sacred 260-day ritual cycle, governed spiritual life and personal destiny. The Xiuhpohualli, a 365-day solar calendar, measured the agricultural year through 18 20-day months, each holding its own festival. Every 52 years, when both calendars converged, the new fire ceremony was held, the most profound renewal rite in Aztec life. A sacred flame was kindled on a mountaintop and carried back to the Templo Mayor, then distributed to every temple and hearth across the city. At the spring equinox, the rising sun aligned precisely between the 2 summit shrines, as though the temple itself breathed with the turning of the heavens. Aztec society moved in carefully ordered layers. At its highest point sat the Pipiltin, the hereditary nobility, whose sons received the finest education and who held positions in governance, the priesthood, and military command. Below them moved the Macehualtin, the great mass of commoners, farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers who worked the land and sustained the city. The relationship between these worlds was governed not simply by custom, but by a worldview that placed every soul in a divinely assigned position. The Pipiltin were understood as trained by the gods to lead. The Macahualtin were understood to have been fashioned to sustain society through their labor. Limited paths existed between these worlds, though the highest places remained largely closed to those born outside noble families. Children in Tenochtitlan grew toward two different schools, depending on the family into which they were born. Noble sons attended the Kalmakak, the House of Penance, where they learned to read and write, to study astronomy and calendrics, to compose poetry, and to train for war and leadership. Commoner boys attended the Telpochkali, the young men's house, where physical conditioning, weapon handling, and martial endurance formed the core of their education. Girls received instruction in weaving, cooking, religious rites, and song. All children, regardless of their school, were taught the Huitlatoli, the ancient proverbs, which carried values of humility, obedience, hard work, and devotion to the gods into every young mind. Women within this world moved through roles that were essential and deeply embedded in religious meaning. In early Aztec life, women had held roughly equal legal and economic rights with men, though as the empire became increasingly militaristic, these boundaries narrowed. Women wove and spun textiles, prepared maize through the careful nixtamalization process, tended livestock, and managed the household economy. They carried surplus goods to markets to barter and sell. Religiously, the role of women was understood as the counterbalance to men's battlefield obligations. A girl's umbilical cord was buried by the hearth, binding her to the ancient fire god at the center of the universe. The hearth and the battlefield were considered twin pillars holding the world in place. The arts of Tenochtitlan reached remarkable heights. Featherwork was considered the most precious of all crafts. Intricate creations assembled from quetzal plumes, macaw feathers, and cotinga blues by the Amantaka, a guild of specialist artisans with their own neighborhood, their own patron deity, and exemption from tribute. Feathers were gathered as tribute from conquered lands, for quetzals could not survive in captivity and carried only 2 tail feathers each. Poetry, known as flower and song, flowed through both noble halls and common festivals. The ruler of Texcoco, Nezahualcoyotl, composed verses that have survived into the present age. Great stone sculptures painted codices, and the calendar stone encoded the cosmos itself in permanent form. Within the gardens of Moctezuma II, rare orchids and vanilla vines brought from tropical provinces grew beside towering ahuehuetl cypresses along canal-lined paths. Beside these gardens stood the Totokali, the house of birds, where quetzals, eagles, jaguars, pumas, and crocodiles were tended by dedicated servants. Spanish conquistadors who entered these grounds in 1519 found themselves at a loss for words. Bernal Diaz del Castillo called one garden the finest he had ever seen. Cortés privately admitted his admiration, even as he later ordered its destruction. This was the world that had flourished for nearly 2 centuries inside these canals and causeways, and it was about to encounter a force it had never imagined. In the next chapter, the footsteps of strangers arriving from the east will begin to sound, carrying with them not only weapons but questions that would unsettle everything the Aztec world believed about itself. Chapter 4. Strangers from the Sea. Cortés, Moctezuma, and the First Contact. From the sun-baked hills of Extremadura, Spain, a young man named Hernán Cortés carried restlessness like a second skin. Born around 1485 into a family of lesser nobility, honorable in name, modest in wealth, He studied law at Salamanca for 2 years before the books could no longer hold him. Tales drifting across the Atlantic spoke of golden lands and uncharted possibilities. Cortés abandoned his studies, abandoned provincial life, and turned his gaze westward. He was clever, ambitious, and entirely unwilling to settle for smallness. The world he sought was vast, and he intended to claim a place within it. By 1504, Cortés had reached Hispaniola and eventually Cuba, where he spent 15 years building a colonial life, earning an encomienda, serving twice as a magistrate, and establishing himself as a man of consequence. Yet Cuba felt like a cage. When Governor Velázquez appointed him to lead a mainland expedition in 1518, then swiftly withdrew that permission, Cortés did not comply. In February 1519, he sailed anyway. An unauthorized voyage assembled from 11 ships, roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and 14 artillery pieces. It was a rogue expedition dressed in the language of royal ambition, departing before doubt could anchor him to shore. The fleet first touched land at Tabasco on Mexico's Gulf Coast, where Cortés gathered intelligence and received gifts from local peoples. Among those gifts were 20 enslaved women. One of them was Malinal, born around 1500 to an Aztec chieftain, later sold into slavery after her father's death. Fluent in Nahuatl and Yucatec Maya, she quickly acquired Spanish as well. Cortés chose her as his consort and interpreter, and she became known as Doña Marina, or, to Nahuatl speakers, Malintzin. History would call her La Malinche. Without her voice, bridging languages and cultures that would otherwise have remained impenetrable to one another, the expedition's early negotiations would have been impossible. On the Gulf Coast near the settlement he would name Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, Cortés encountered the Totonac people. Long dominated by the Aztec Empire, the Totonac carried deep resentment. Tribute collectors arrived like hungry coyotes, and hundreds of their children were sent annually to Tenochtitlan for ritual sacrifice. When Cortés arrived in June 1519 with his soldiers and horses, Totonac leader Xicomecoatl saw something the Aztecs had never offered, a possible path to freedom. 30 towns gathered at Chempoala, and an alliance was formed. The Totonac contributed over 1,000 warriors, provisions, guides, and knowledge of the interior. The first of many partnerships that would reshape the continent. The march inland was long and relentless. From Veracruz, the army climbed from humid coastal lowlands through cold mountain passes, where some indigenous allies from tropical regions perished from the extreme cold. Soldiers endured heavy rains, hunger, and exhaustion as they ascended the Sierra. Forests of oak and pine gave way to high volcanic plateaus. Eventually, the route carried them between the great volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, their snow-capped peaks rising in silence above the army's slow procession. The Aztecs had suggested an easier southern road, but Tlaxcalan allies warned it was likely a trap. Cortés chose the harder path. It nearly always led somewhere extraordinary. Before reaching the heart of the Aztec world, Cortés first had to pass through Tlaxcala, and the Tlaxcalans did not open their gates willingly. In September 1519, a fierce battle erupted. Cortés later claimed to have faced over 100,000 warriors. The Spanish sustained significant losses, nearly 45 men dead from battle, wounds, or disease, yet held their ground. Impressed by Spanish military endurance, Tlaxcalan King Xicotenga eventually allowed the army to enter the capital on September 18th. Over 20 days, Cortés forged a careful alliance, promising that Tlaxcala would preserve its autonomy within a Spanish-ordered Mexico. For a people surrounded by Aztec enemies, it was an offer difficult to refuse. Far to the west within the island city of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II had been watching. Since 1518, when the first reports of strange vessels arrived from the eastern coast, he had posted watchguards, sent emissaries, and studied the newcomers carefully. He consulted his priests and turned to the Aztec calendar. The year the Spanish arrived, 1519, corresponded to Se Acatl, one reed, the year long associated with the legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god said to have departed eastward and promised to return. Whether Moctezuma truly believed Cortés embodied that prophecy remains deeply disputed among historians. What is certain is that he sent lavish gifts of gold and silver, perhaps to impress, perhaps to deter, perhaps simply to understand. On 8th November 1519, the two worlds finally met face to face. On the great stone causeway leading into Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II descended from his royal litter to greet Hernán Cortés. Gifts were exchanged. The emperor offered an Aztec calendar stone, a disc of gold, a disc of silver, and necklaces of red shell from which hung golden shrimps the size of a man's hand. Cortés placed around Moctezuma's neck a necklace of scented glass beads. The Florentine Codex records that Moctezuma's speech was deferential, even reverent, language so elaborately courteous that later Spanish interpreters would use it to suggest the emperor viewed Cortés as divine. Historians now treat that interpretation with considerable caution. The Spanish were given quarters in the palace of Axayacatl, at the heart of Tenochtitlan. Cortés was taken to the summit of the city's highest pyramid and shown the full breadth of the Aztec capital below. What he saw left him without adequate words. The city stretched across a vast lake, connected by broad causeways, its canals alive with canoes, its markets thundering with commerce. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's army, wrote that the sight resembled an enchanted vision from the tales of Amadis, and that some soldiers questioned whether they were truly awake. Palaces, aviaries, temples, and gardens surrounded by water. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary cities on earth. Within days of his arrival, Cortés made a calculated and dangerous decision. He seized Moctezuma, took the emperor prisoner within his own palace, allowing him to function as a figurehead while Spanish authority tightened around the empire like a quiet knot. The Aztec imperial system depended on visible power, and the emperor's captivity fractured that foundation. Rebellions began to stir. Then, in May 1520, Cortés was forced to leave the city to confront a rival Spanish force sent by Governor Velázquez under Pánfilo de Narváez. He left Pedro de Alvarado in command. It was a decision that would cost everything. During the sacred feast of Toxcatl, Alvarado ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles celebrating in the Great Temple. The city erupted. The Aztec population rose in fury. Moctezuma, compelled by Cortés to speak to his own people from the palace walls, was struck down by stones and arrows hurled by his own subjects. A ruler, betrayed by captivity, denied even the dignity of his own authority. The Aztec nobility named his brother Cuitláhuac as the new emperor. Cortés returned from defeating Narvaez only to find the city in full revolt, his forces besieged and starving. On the night of June 30th, 1520, he ordered a desperate retreat across the causeways in darkness. The fragile peace that had held two worlds together in that extraordinary city was now shattered beyond repair, and in the night that followed, both sides would pay a terrible price. A night so catastrophic that the Spanish would remember it simply as the sad night, the Noche Triste. Chapter 5. The Fall of Tenochtitlan. Siege, Plague, and Conquest. On the night of June 30th to July 1st, 1520, under the cover of darkness and storm, Hernán Cortés led his forces in a desperate, silent retreat from Tenochtitlan. For 98 days the Spanish had occupied the great Aztec capital, holding Emperor Moctezuma II as their prisoner. But the city had grown restless, and now the Aztecs had risen against them. Cortés ordered his men westward along the causeway toward Tlacopan, a portable bridge constructed to cross the gaps where the Aztecs had broken the road. They carried as much gold as they could hold. Then, in the darkness, they were discovered. The assault came swiftly. 100 of Aztec warriors, coordinated by Cuitlahuac, struck the retreating column from the water and the broken causeway. The battle was catastrophic for the Spanish. Between 400 and 800 soldiers were killed or captured that night, along with 2,000 to 4,000 of their native allies. Nearly all their artillery, their horses, and the plundered Aztec gold sank into the dark waters of the lake. The Mexica had won a decisive victory. Cortés and his surviving men fled eastward toward Tlaxcala, wounded and defeated. The night became known in Spanish memory as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. In the village of Popotla, according to legend, the exhausted Cortés paused beneath an ancient ahuehuete cypress tree and wept at the sight of his straggling, blooded survivors. The tree would carry that grief for centuries. By the 19th century, an iron fence and a stone plaque marked it as El Árbol de la Noche Triste, the Tree of the Sad Night, a quiet monument to that crushing defeat. In recent years, Mexico has begun reclaiming the story. The tree is now also called Árbol de la Noche Victoriosa, the Tree of the Victorious Night, reframing the event through indigenous eyes, honoring the Mexica who drove the Spanish from their city. 1 week after the Night of Sorrows, the retreating Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies were intercepted again on the plains near Teotihuacan, at a place called Otumba. An Aztec force closed in around them. It seemed the Spanish might be destroyed entirely. Then Cortés led a cavalry charge directly at the Aztec commander. He cut the man down and seized the Mexica war standard. Without their commander, the Aztec formation lost its cohesion, and the assault collapsed. The Battle of Otumba gave the survivors the respite they desperately needed. They reached Tlaxcala safely, and the Tlaxcalans, despite Aztec offers of peace, chose to keep their alliance with Cortés. While Cortés recovered in Tlaxcala, something invisible and devastating had already entered Tenochtitlan. A man named Francisco Eguía, traveling with the Narvaez expedition as a soldier or enslaved African, had carried smallpox ashore along the Yucatan coast. By September 1520, the disease had spread inland through Tlaxcala and Tepeaca, and was now moving through the streets of the Aztec capital. The population of Tenochtitlan had no immunity, Families fell ill together. Warriors weakened. Leaders died. The epidemic lasted approximately 70 days and killed roughly 1 in 8 inhabitants. Somewhere between 14 and 15,000 people, leaving survivors scarred, some of them blind. Among those who died of smallpox was Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had driven the Spanish from Tenochtitlan. He had ruled for only 4 months. His death in October 1520 left the empire without its most vigorous defender at the worst possible moment. The Aztec nobles then elected a young man of 24 years to take the throne, Cuauhtémoc, whose name meant descending eagle. Son of the great emperor Ahuitzotl, nephew and son-in-law of Moctezuma II, Cuauhtémoc had been educated in the elite Calmecac schools and had already proven himself as a ruler. Now, with the Spanish regrouping beyond the mountains, he prepared to defend his city. Through the summer and autumn of 1520, Cortés methodically rebuilt his forces in Tlaxcala. His surviving troops rested and recovered. The Tlaxcalan city-state renewed its commitment, providing thousands of warriors. Hostile groups across the region, long resentful of Aztec dominance, added their strength to the alliance. Spanish steel salvaged from Lake Texcoco was repaired and rearmed. And then came the most extraordinary logistical undertaking of the entire campaign. Cortés ordered the construction of 13 shallow-hulled brigantines, small warships, to be built inland by master shipbuilder Martín López, using timber salvaged from ships Cortés had destroyed at Veracruz the previous year. The brigantines could not simply be sailed to Tenochtitlan. They had to be carried there. Prefabricated ship components were man-portaged approximately 60 miles overland from Tlaxcala, crossing mountain terrain and enemy-held territory. Thousands of Tlaxcalan laborers accomplished this over days of exhausting travel. Once the timber reached the lakeshore near Texcoco, an extraordinary challenge remained. The shipyard was landlocked. Cortés ordered the excavation of an enormous canal, 12 feet wide and 12 feet deep, stretching more than 9,000 feet from the shipyard to the lake. Over 7 weeks, an estimated 40,000 workers dug the waterway. In late April 1521, the brigantines were floated out onto Lake Texcoco. By May 1521, Cortés had assembled a force of approximately 100,000 indigenous allies. Tlaxcalans forming the largest contingent, alongside Texcoco warriors, Otumba forces, and Totonac fighters. The Spanish themselves numbered far fewer, but they brought firearms, steel armor, 18 field guns, and now 13 armed brigantines carrying Lombards and Falconese. Cortés divided his land forces into 3 columns, each moving up a different causeway toward the island city. The brigantines swept across the lake, breaking Aztec naval dominance and cutting off supplies. The 3 great causeways, to Iztapalapa, Tacuba, and Tepeyacac, became the axes of a slow, relentless closing siege. Inside the besieged city, the suffering was beyond description. The aqueducts from Chapultepec had been cut, stripping 200,000 people of their fresh water. The population was forced to drink brackish lake water, which brought dysentery alongside thirst. Food disappeared entirely. People consumed lizards, corn cobs, weeds, leather, and dirt. Mothers stripped the clothing from their children to offer to the gods, leaving the young ones bare. The smallpox epidemic had already claimed thousands. Street by street, the Spanish and their allies advanced, burning houses and demolishing temples as they went. Cuauhtémoc organized fierce counterattacks and his warriors adapted, dodging sideways when cannon fired, retreating into the narrow spaces where cavalry could not follow. On August 13th, 1521, after 93 days of siege, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape across Lake Texcoco by canoe with his family and a small retinue of nobles. Spanish soldiers intercepted him on the western side of the lake. Brought before Cortés, the last Aztec emperor spoke without fear. He asked Cortés to take the dagger from his belt and end his life. Cortés did not. Cuauhtémoc would later be tortured with fire to reveal hidden treasure, his body broken, but his silence unbroken, before being hanged in Honduras in 1525. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, its pyramids toppled, its canals choked, its people scattered. A Nahuatl poem would later say only, "The smoke is rising, the haze is spreading." The city had fallen, its emperor captured, and its streets lay in silence. But beneath the rubble of conquest, the memory of Tenochtitlan refused to disappear entirely, and across the centuries it would wait, buried but not forgotten, for those who would finally come to listen. Chapter 6. Buried but not forgotten. Rediscovery and legacy. When Tenochtitlan fell in August of 1521, Hernán Cortés did not merely claim a city. He ordered its careful dismantling. Stone by stone, the great temples were taken apart. Canals were filled, causeways were removed. The surviving Aztec population was expelled to Tlatelolco, and in their place rose a new colonial order. The cut limestone and carved marble of Aztec temples became the literal foundations of cathedrals and government buildings. A new city was born directly upon the bones of the old. And for a time it was called Mexico Tenochtitlan, as if the two worlds could share one name. Mexico City grew directly over Tenochtitlan's sacred geography. The central plaza still rests upon the site of the Templo Mayor. Several of the city's great avenues follow, with quiet faithfulness, the paths of Tenochtitlan's original causeways. North toward Tepeyac, west toward Tacuba, south toward Iztapalapa. Yet beneath the colonial grid, the older map endured. The lake was drained, the canals were buried. But the quadripartite design of the Aztec city, organized around the four cardinal directions and rooted in cosmological meaning, left its imprint on the streets that replaced it. The bones of the old city shaped the body of the new. The city built upon the old lake bed has never stopped settling. The thick layers of soft clay and silt deposited when Lake Texcoco covered this basin continue to compress beneath the weight of millions. Excessive extraction of groundwater accelerates the process. Some zones have sunk nearly 20 inches in a single year. Buildings tilt, roads fracture. The subway system bears the strain. This gradual descent, documented as early as the 1920s and measured by satellite today, is a quiet reminder that the city of Mexico City rests not on solid ground, but on the memory of water, on the ancient bed of the very lake that once cradled Tenochtitlan. Even as the city above was being built, a quieter form of preservation was underway. Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan missionary working from the Colegio de la Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco, spent decades gathering knowledge from Nahua elders and indigenous scholars. Together they produced the Florentine Codex, 12 illustrated books spanning some 2,400 pages, written in Nahuatl, Spanish, and Latin, documenting the customs, beliefs, history, and worldview of central Mexico's people. After its completion, the manuscript traveled to Europe and entered the Medici Library in Florence, where it rests still, one of the most remarkable records of a civilization at the moment of contact. The Florentine Codex was not alone. Among the indigenous manuscripts that survived the conquest, the Codex Mendoza, the Codex Borbonicus, the Codex Boturini, and others preserved in pictographic script what the fires of the Spanish campaign could not fully erase. Created by Tlacuelos, painters of great esteem, these manuscripts documented Tenochtitlan's founding myth, its canal maps, its tribute records, its ritual calendars, and the daily life of its people. Some may be pre-Hispanic. Others were commissioned by Spanish priests who understood that a world was dissolving and wished, in some form, to hold it still. Together, these codices carry the voice of a civilization speaking in images across 5 centuries. The Aztec nobility, granted recognition by the Spanish colonial regime with titles of Don and Doña, also played a quiet role in preserving what endured. Spanish Franciscan friars taught Nahua aristocrats and scribes to write their language using the Latin alphabet, creating a tradition of alphabetic Nahuatl literature that continued through the colonial centuries. These painter-scribes produced land records, genealogies, local histories, and religious manuals, blending their ancient pictographic traditions with the new orthography. The collaborative work of indigenous scholars with figures like Sahagún became the principal source through which modern historians have come to understand post-conquest central Mexico, a fragile bridge built from memory and ink. In December of 1790, workers repairing the Plaza Mayor in Mexico City struck something buried some 40 centimeters below the surface. What emerged was enormous. A basalt monolith over 3.5 meters across, weighing more than 24,000 kilograms. The Aztec sunstone buried since the conquest had returned. Mounted on an exterior wall of the cathedral where it remained for nearly a century, it was eventually moved in 1885 to the National Museum of Anthropology. That same year of 1790 also brought up the Coatlicue statue, the great Earth Mother Goddess carved between 1487 and 1500, her skirt of serpents and necklace of hearts intact, standing over 2.5 meters tall. Nearly 2 centuries later, on a February morning in 1978, electrical workers digging near the main plaza uncovered something unexpected in the earth. A massive circular stone carved in low relief. It depicted a goddess in dismemberment, her limbs spread across the basalt surface, golden bells at her cheeks, feathers in her hair. This was the Coyolxauhqui stone, carved around 1473, originally placed at the base of the Templo Mayor's Great Staircase. Its discovery triggered something far larger than itself. A systematic archaeological excavation was launched, led by Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, that would spend decades slowly uncovering the buried heart of Tenochtitlan beneath the streets of modern Mexico City. The Templo Mayor project that Eduardo Matos Moctezuma directed from 1978 onward became one of the most significant archaeological undertakings in the Americas. Over decades, his multidisciplinary team uncovered more than 200 ritual offerings. Volcanic stone boxes containing greenstone sculptures, thousands of marine shells, obsidian knives, clay pots bearing the face of Tlaloc, wooden masks retaining traces of ancient pigment, crocodile skeletons, and coral. They found the Palace of the Eagle Warriors. They recovered the great Tlaltekutli earth goddess monolith in 2006. Each layer of earth peeled back revealed another chapter of a city that had been buried but never truly silenced, its offerings still arranged as they had been placed, centuries undisturbed. The legacy of Tenochtitlan did not remain buried in stone alone. It lives in the national symbols of modern Mexico, most visibly in the eagle devouring a serpent upon a cactus that rests at the center of the Mexican flag, drawn directly from the founding prophecy of the Mexica people. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, stands honored in bronze at one of Mexico City's great intersections, while Cortés holds no monument in the capital he conquered. Indigenous and Nahua communities continue to speak forms of their ancient language, celebrate their ritual calendars, and use their ancestral connection to Tenochtitlan's legacy to advocate for land rights and cultural recognition within the modern state that rose from its ruins. Beneath the streets of Mexico City, excavations continue still. In cathedral basements beneath earthquake rubble, along subway lines and under plaza flagstones, archaeologists of the National Institute of Anthropology and History piece together the buried city. 40,000 artifacts gathered and more emerging each season. Jade and turquoise masks, Pacific turtle shells, obsidian mirrors. The stones of Tenochtitlan have not finished speaking. They surface slowly, gently, as the city above them shifts and settles on its ancient lake clay foundation. And so the story of Tenochtitlan comes to rest, not as a tale of endings, but as one of layers, of memory buried and recovered, of a great civilization that built its home on water and prophecy, and whose stones even now lie just beneath our feet, waiting quietly to be found.